Probably like 5 times before I thought I really understood the argument. Maybe.
It is about time to get things started, ladies and gentlemen. I want to thank you all so very, very much for being here. My name is Ben Miller. I'm listed as the organizer of this event, but I must tell you that is really quite bogus, because it's Susanna Black and
Speak up.
It's really Susanna Black and Megan Ritchie and a number of other people I've seen kind of bustling around with all sorts of just excellent background work that's made this weekend possible. And so I want to thank really all of them for their labors, and thank you all for being here. It's an honor to have you. And obviously we're in a meaty hour in our nation's history, and so I think we've got a lot to think and talk about this weekend. And grateful especially tonight for our participants, speakers, Brad Littlejohn and Matthew Schmitz. And I'm just going to say a word of prayer and then ask Dr. David Innes here at the King's College to come and introduce our speakers for the evening. Almighty God and our Father, we ask you in these hours we have together, in your grace and kindness to us through Christ, that you will give us the wisdom you've told us we need but ask for, and you will give it abundantly without chiding us. Give us humility, give us brotherly love, and make us useful in the service of your kingdom to this time. We ask in Jesus' good name. Amen. Dr. Innes.
Well, good evening. On behalf of the King's College, welcome to the second Mid-Atlantic Regional Convivium of the Davenant Trust. I'm David Innes, Associate Professor of Politics here at the King's College and Chairman of the program in Politics, Philosophy, and Economics. This is a happy night. I've been looking forward to this just because of what is going to happen. And then I saw the guest list. I got happier. Well, just look around you. You'll understand. I expect most people, perhaps everyone knows what the Davenant Trust is. The Davenant Trust, just in case you're in any way unsure of yourself here, the Davenant Trust was organized to support the renewal of Christian wisdom among today's Reformed and evangelical churches by sponsoring historical scholarship at the intersection of church and academy, building networks of friendship and collaboration within the Reformed and evangelical world, and equipping saints with time-tested resources for faithful public witness. Tonight, we have with us 2 speakers who are well-suited to address the topic for our consideration, Christian citizenship in post-Christian America, Matthew Schmitz and Dr. W. Bradford Littlejohn. And you're expecting to hear from Matthew Schmitz first, and then Brad Littlejohn, but it is not so. They have switched just to keep you all on your toes. So first I will introduce Dr. Littlejohn. Bradford Littlejohn is the president of the Davenant Trust, and so really the reason we are here tonight. He received his PhD in theological ethics from the University of Edinburgh in 2013 and serves as adjunct professor of philosophy at the Moody Bible Institute. He has published numerous articles and book chapters on Reformation thought, political theology, and Christian ethics. As you can see from the book table, I underscore the book table, his field of particular expertise is the English and remarkably judicious theologian Richard Hooker. He is the author of Richard Hooker, a companion to his life and work, and forthcoming from Erdman's in 2017. I checked the internet, you can't pre-order yet on Amazon, but we're waiting for that. The Promise and Peril of Christian Liberty, Richard Hooker, the Puritans, and Protestant Political Thought. His presentation tonight is taken largely from that book and is entitled Protestantism and Political Liberalism, A Complicated Relationship. Welcome, Dr. Littlejohn.
Thank you, David, and I'm very grateful to David for his work in putting this together and for the King's College as a whole in their wonderful hospitality for this event. So yes, my paper, we're going to be, through this event this evening and later tomorrow afternoon, exploring what it means to be a Christian citizen in post-Christian America. My lecture will be primarily looking backwards, starting with kind of historical reflection on how did Protestantism and how didn't Protestantism contribute to political liberalism, and how should that shape how we think of the liberal tradition. So I'm going to begin with a famous quote from John Calvin. "We may call the one the spiritual, the other the civil kingdom. Now these two, as we have divided them, are always to be viewed apart from each other. When the one is considered, we should call off our minds and not allow them to think of the other. For there exists in man a kind of two worlds over which different kings and different laws can preside. By attending to this distinction, we will not erroneously transfer the doctrine of the gospel concerning spiritual liberty to civil order, as if in regard to external government, Christians were less subject to human laws because their consciences are unbound before God, as if they were exempted from all carnal service because in regard to the spirit, they are free." This is from Institutes 3.19.15 on Christian liberty. From the moment that Christ enigmatically rebuffed Herod's political theologians with the words, "Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's," his followers had to grapple with the challenge of living under different kings and different laws. At various times and places, some have been so bold as to imagine they had removed the sting from Christ's statement, whether by bringing God and Caesar into alliance, by restricting their kingdoms to different worlds, or that Caesar would adopt pluralistic policies that would grant free rein to any religious conscience. Each such solution has in due course been exposed as an over-optimistic illusion, leaving Christians to grapple anew with the tensions of their dual citizenship. Whatever the failures of Reformation political thought, it must be at least credited with its refusal to blithely dismiss this problem. Indeed, few questions were more central to early Protestant theology and churchmanship. The quote I begin with can claim to be something of a classic text when it comes to Reformation political thought, appearing constantly in the secondary literature, although its meaning is hotly contested. Why is Calvin so concerned to warn us against a transfer of spiritual liberty to civil order? Why does he insist that we call off our minds from political issues when we consider this doctrine of Christian liberty? Certainly, most of those who have written on the topic of Protestantism and modern political thought have tended to ignore this warning. A host of preachers, writers, and scholars throughout the past 3 centuries have been busy making just this transfer, the so-called Whig history of liberty, in which Protestantism, with its protest against papal authority, unleashed an unstoppable impulse toward individual freedom, toppling tyrannical governments, establishing constitutional order, separating church and state, and eventually, for many of its 20th century advocates at least, generating human rights. Even if spiritual liberty and civil liberty ought not to be conflated, such historians argue, one cannot deny the historical fact that the proclamation of the latter closely succeeded the former, with a geographical as well as a temporal correlation to the centers of the Protestant Reformation. To dismiss this as a historical accident, or is there some inward connection by which Protestantism served as the midwife for civil liberties and the separation of church and state? And if there is some connection, it is certainly curious that Calvin is so eager to deny it. In this lecture, I hope to both challenge and then finally defend the notion that Protestantism's proclamation of freedom of conscience helped give birth to the modern liberal version. The challenge can be posed on multiple fronts. First, we must face the obvious difficulty that whereas Luther's ideal of a liberated conscience was one in bondage to the Word of God, modern liberalism seems inherently pluralistic. It is the freedom of every individual to worship any god or none, and reflect that worship in their lives as fully or minimally as they like. This difference at the individual level is mirrored at the political level. Modern liberalism's sine qua non is its insistence that this freedom of conscience must be guarded as an inviolable political right, with apparent corollaries about the inappropriateness of religious establishment of any kind. Luther and his followers, however, had little hesitation in retaining and indeed insisting upon the Christendom model, in which orthodoxy was defended and indeed imposed by political authority. Indeed, I will argue that this reflects not so much a difference between Luther and modern liberalism, but a tension that runs right through any account of liberty of conscience, pre-modern or modern. If individual conscience is not to be aimless and anarchistic, must it not be bound to a higher law? And if so, must it not seek to remake the political order in obedience to that law, actively overthrowing injustice rather than quietly pursuing its own freedom of worship? Without such an activist idea of conscience, oriented towards some universal law, an appeal to liberty of conscience seems a call for the disintegration of society into an interminable conflict of myriad self-justifying preferences, which is the paralysis that grips late modern consumer society. If such an activist conscience dominates, however, the social order is always in danger of being overthrown by a band of zealots whose campaign for justice and righteousness threatens to trample underfoot the liberty of any consciences that might beg to differ. This is the danger that religious traditionalists today fear from the successive waves of social justice crusades that have reshaped Western liberalism in recent decades. In either case, it should be noted, freedom of conscience seems to be pitted against the freedom of a commonwealth to be or act as a commonwealth, rather than a mere collection of individuals. So, section 2, Two Tales of Two Cities, Calvinism and the Transfer of Liberty. There are many different narratives as to how the transfer of spiritual to civil liberty played out. But I want to highlight two main versions of the narrative, which I will call the quietist and the activist versions. Note that these two labels are merely heuristic. In practice, they function more as poles along a spectrum, and indeed, as we will soon see, can readily blur into one another. To oversimplify radically, the quietist forms are perhaps more concerned with Isaiah Berlin's negative liberty, in this case, the freedom of the religious conscience to be left alone to its religious activities, while the activist forms are more interested in the development of positive liberty. In this case, the freedom of the religious conscience to empower individuals or societies through putting its convictions into action. The quietist forms thus attempt to defame the conflict of loyalties by using liberty of conscience itself as the means to adjudicate the boundaries of each set of loyalties. Indeed, Calvin's quote above could be read as doing just this, assigning the just bounds of civil authority to prevent it from meddling in affairs of conscience. The great historian of political thought, Quentin Skinner, offered an influential version of the quietist form of the narrative in his Foundations of Modern Political Thought. Essential to the modern idea of politics, he says, is the idea that, quote, political society is held to exist solely for political purposes. The endorsement of this secularized viewpoint remained impossible as long as it was assumed that all temporal rulers had a duty to uphold godly as well as peaceful government. Of course, Skinner unhesitatingly acknowledges that the Protestant reformers hardly abandoned this medieval assumption. Rather, they consistently upheld the ideal of the godly prince, even if he thinks their theology tended in directions that would sever the medieval synthesis of theology and political philosophy. Nonetheless, the circumstances of persecution and the need to assert their freedom of conscience against ungodly magistrates led to a key shift, he argues. Within Skinner's narrative, the key moment was the move by Protestant resistance theorists from the language of a duty to resist idolatrous tyrants, grounded in religious obligations to protect right worship, to the language of a right to resist tyrants in the face of their violation of constitutional laws and norms of civil justice. Quote, they were able, that is, to make the epoch-making move from a purely religious theory of resistance, depending on the idea of a covenant to uphold the laws of God, to a genuinely political theory of revolution, based on the idea of a contract which gives rise to a moral right, and not merely a religious duty, to resist any ruler who fails in his corresponding obligation to pursue the welfare of the people in all his public acts. In other words, under pressure of persecution and faced with rapid changes in policy by successions of more favorable and more hostile regimes, Protestants quickly adopted the notion of a general political right to freedom of worship and assembly, which any just regime must protect. Any regime, whether Protestant or Catholic, could be equally compelled by the same arguments to uphold this right, grounded as it was in the nature of political society itself. It may seem odd to label a view forged in the fires of religious war quietist, but the point is that for Skinner, the end point of the conflict was a conscience left alone in an increasingly private sphere, recognized by the political realm, but buffered from it. Modern political liberalism, of course, does not spring fully formed out of this transition. Nonetheless, thinks Skinner, this emergence of an autonomous sphere of political rationality was necessary and essential for the development of liberal order. And while he denies that this development emerges directly out of the Reformers' teachings, he does see it as the natural fruit of the political crises the Reformation generated, and the Reformers' firm removal of temporal authority from ecclesiastical control. John Whitty's Reformation of Rights, as the title suggests, also focuses on the emergence of rights language within the early Reformed tradition, as seminal to the development of liberal political order. Unlike Skinner, he is less concerned about how the Reformation might lead to an autonomous political order than he is about how it might lead to a pluralistic one dedicated to individual freedom. And though he recognizes the journey is a long one, he believes that it begins not in unintended consequences, but in the theological teaching of the Reformers. Although he acknowledges Calvin's firm distinction between spiritual and political liberty and his warnings against a transfer, Whitty is confident that the distinction itself grounds a progressive development of political liberty by putting religious matters outside the reach of coercive authority, and thus laying the groundwork for a wider range of individual rights. Of course, Whitty is the first to admit the actual practice of Calvin's Geneva was far from liberal in this respect, but he insists that the principle laid important groundwork. By means of these two factors, argues Whitty, this first right of freedom of conscience became, over the course of a lengthy historical development, both the mother and the midwife of the many other civil liberties we now enjoy. David Van Drunen, in his Natural Law in the Two Kingdoms, has recently offered a longer and more theologically complex narrative that shares some similar themes, emphasizing the anti-perfectionism of Calvin's political vision and its stress on the separation of church and state. One thing that each of these narratives share in common, though, is the relatively passive role that Protestant clergy and citizens play in it, although I must stress the word relatively here. Certainly Skinner, Whitty, and Van Drunen all have a great deal to say about the resistance theorists and the important role played by their stand against tyrannical authorities who transgress the bounds of religious liberty. But still, heroic and hard-won though these changes may have been, the basic mindset is still one of laissez-faire, of a certain kind of quietism. That is to say, on narratives such as these, the way that Protestantism upset the medieval political order was simply by demanding a sphere of immunity for its religious principles, a sphere in which to obey God rather than man, thus effecting a slow transformation of the civil order so as to protect the pursuit of godliness, but without itself being directly concerned with this pursuit. This approach must be contrasted with more activist accounts of the development from spiritual to civil liberty in Protestant and particularly Calvinist communities. These lay much more stress on the other side of the freedom of conscience that we noted above, the freedom to obey God's word. To obey God's word is, of course, to put it into practice, and often in the social sphere just as much as in the individual sphere. Needless to say, on this narrative, the more theocratic manifestations of the Calvinist tradition, which for Whitty and Van Drunen must be treated as outliers, the results of Protestants not really following through in their principles, these look much more like natural fruitions of the liberated Protestant conscience. The noted political theorists Michael Walzer and Eric Vogelin, each in their own ways, saw the fundamental legacy of the Protestant Reformation as one of radicalism and activism, reform and revolution in the political sphere. On this account, Calvin's warning against a transfer was quite directly ignored, with a quasi-Anabaptistic radicalism, the legacy of many of his followers. And of course, as with most cases of radical reform, the line between freedom and totalitarianism proving a tenuous one. Let's consider Vogelin's version of the thesis, since for him, the key development is closer to what we identified above in the tension between the testimony of private conscience and the truth to which the public order witnesses. Not that Vogelin thinks the Reformation marked a fundamentally new departure in this regard. Rather, Vogelin discerns the Reformation, and in Calvinist movements in particular, a version of the Gnosticism that he identifies as a perennial temptation within Christianity. For Vogelin, the essence of the Gnostic is not content with the material world, the sense in which the term is most frequently tossed around nowadays, but the claim to secret knowledge, knowledge that gives him the key to the meaning of history. By virtue of their private revelation, opaque to the surrounding society, Gnostic groups will lay claim to the mantle of being called by God to usher in the next stage of history, whether that be one in which all God's people are prophets, or one in which private property and finally the state are abolished. Vogelin considers the modern world to be a string of experiments in secularized Gnosticism, with communism but the most pronounced example. In this paradigm, freedom of conscience hardly leads to pluralism, except possibly as an eventual unintended byproduct. Rather, the freedom of the conscience to obey God, or the zeitgeist, rather than man, demands the transformation of human authority structures to conform to the divine order. The Reformation did not introduce the possibility of such movements, but it did make them more likely and more natural, Vogelin argues. Calvin, and especially his English followers, the Puritans, did more than anyone to bring the Gnostic spirit into the modern world. It is not difficult to see that these narratives contrast rather sharply with those of Skinner, Whitty, and Van Drunen. Indeed, Vogelin's would seem to be almost the polar opposite. Here is the Calvinist not as anti-perfectionist, but as arch-perfectionist, not as separationist, but as arch-transformationalist. Of course, both Walser and Vogelin were political theorists who enjoyed painting with rather broad brush, not Reformation historians. But we should not be too quick to dismiss them on that account. On the contrary, any honest look at the historical evidence suggests that there is every bit as much an activist legacy to Protestantism, and perhaps Calvinism in particular, as there is a quietist one. Philip Benedict's magisterial survey of the Reformed tradition, Christ Church's purely Reformed, highlights this impulse, not political revolution per se, but certainly aggressive social reform, as lying at the heart of the Calvinist tradition. This reformist impulse may not have always taken on the form of freedom as we tend to imagine it. Indeed, it was often downright repressive. But inasmuch as Reformed churches and communities were ready to challenge the status quo in favor of the will of God as they understood it, they signaled an awareness of the possibility of a clash of loyalties, in which obedience to God demanded a remaking of the social and political order. And this is certainly a kind of freedom. This sort of freedom, this fervent obedience of the conscience to a higher law than that of the state, was accordingly to become a powerful force for reform in England and America through the succeeding centuries, even as it lost some of its distinctively reformational flavor. In his recent book, Weird John Brown, Ted Smith traces how the language of the higher law, to which conscience must yield, even at the cost of civil disobedience, came to animate the abolitionist movement in America in the mid-19th century. He cites the Declaration of the American Moral Reform Society in 1843. Quote, "Therefore, under whatever pretext or authority these laws have been promulgated or executed, whether under parliamentary, colonial, or American legislation, we declare them in the sight of heaven wholly null and void, and they should be immediately abrogated." He shows that such language could be grounded in more theologically orthodox fashion in the demands of Scripture, as in the rhetoric of Presbyterian minister Henry Highland Garnett, or in a generic theism, as in the rousing Senate speeches of William Seward. But perhaps most representative of the age was the use to which the language of conscience and the higher law was put by the Methodist bishop Gilbert Haven. Smith summarizes, "What Haven called the moral law, though, arose as an expression of a higher human faculty, conscience. Conscience was the vice-regent of God," Haven said, "and while it could be, quote, rendered imperfect and obtuse by reason of sin, it retained a force that is ever pressing it against all temptations," unquote, toward right discernment of an unchanging moral law. As conscience was higher than the social element in humans, the moral law was higher than the civil law in society. Haven's language was unmistakably theological, but the heart of his argument was not a string of biblical texts, but individual conscience. A subtle shift was well underway in how the language of conscience was used. In the older way of speaking, conscience was conscientia, a way of knowing with. But what was the higher law that it knew? The unchanging moral law of God, revealed in nature, and then corroborated and further revealed in Scripture. As Darren Walhoff summarizes, for Calvin at least, quote, "Conscience is that aspect of human nature that innately apprehends the natural law." Conscience then points beyond itself, laying hold of an object to which it then submits. Conscience is an inner and hidden means of knowing, a faculty that belongs to each individual, and yet the truth which it lays hold of is a publicly available one. The law to which it submits is the one to which everyone's conscience witnesses or ought to witness. The appeal to conscience from this standpoint does not seem like such a radical notion. But once one entertains a strong enough view of human depravity, it is easy to imagine that in reality, very few people's consciences are laying hold of the higher law. It lies hidden beyond their grasp. Only those who have received special illumination, and who does not like to count themselves among this number, have rightly functioning consciences that can apply the higher law against the near universal convictions of their contemporaries. This is the essence of Vogeland's Gnosticism, which, whether or not he rightly diagnoses it in Calvin, is indeed a recurring feature of modernity. In this way of thinking about conscience, although the appeal to a higher law remains, it is not hard to see that the conscience itself becomes effectively not the pointer to this law, but its source, a sacrosanct seat of authority that cannot be challenged. The 19th century theologian Orestes Brownson, though himself an abolitionist, challenged this new way of thinking about conscience in the 1850s. Quote, "The appeal to the supreme lawgiver is compatible with civil government, but the appeal to private judgment or conviction as to a higher law than that of the state is not, for it virtually denies government itself by making the individual paramount to it." And Smith summarizes, Brownson argued that relying on individual conscience as a guide to the higher law could end only in anarchy or tyranny. If every individual was left free to follow his or her conscience, there could be no civil order. So if we believe Walser and Vogeland, Protestantism could not have been otherwise from the beginning. If its freedom was a freedom only to obey God, then how could it permit freedom to others, including the governing authorities, not to obey God? 3, an uneasy legacy, liberty of conscience in the liberal age. Both the quietist and the activist narratives, the legacy of Protestantism's declaration of Christian liberty, have much to be said for them. For clearly both impulses were operative within the first decades of the Reformation itself. Indeed, the demand for the freedom to obey the higher law of Scripture could go in either direction, even in very similar faith communities. The Swiss Anabaptists signed the Schleitheim Confession in 1527, eschewing all use of the sword and calling for withdrawal into quietistic communities. But by 1534, some of their brethren were busy trying to usher in the millennium by the sword in nearby Munster. In 17th century France, Presbyterian Calvinists accepted their minority position in society and sought only the freedom to organize and worship, while in nearby England they campaigned vigorously, and in the 1640s violently, for the comprehensive reform of society. Nor, of course, can the two impulses be neatly separated. Even the quietistic demand for freedom of conscience, and the many other liberties that grow out of it, can itself be quite revolutionary. In any case, we moderns, heirs to both legacies, find ourselves increasingly torn between them. We have a love-hate relationship with the increasingly individualized notion of freedom of conscience that Brownson complained about in the 19th century, and the revolutionary impulses it can unleash. Even those modern liberals who might be willing to forgive John Brown his indiscretions for the sake of the sanctity of his cause, might change their tune in evaluating a more recent would-be John Brown, Paul Hill, who killed a Pensacola abortion doctor in 1994. Hill, like Brown, appealed to the Bible in defense of his actions, with complete sincerity and not implausible exegesis. In the face of such violent anarchistic appeals to the higher law to trump the current civil laws, many liberals have called passionately for strict religious neutrality when it comes to political action. And yet those same liberals, most concerned about the intrusion of destabilizing religious appeals in the political process, are likely to be profoundly grateful, despite themselves, for the contributions of such religious discourse to the many profound reforms that our societies now look back on with pride, from Wilberforce's abolition of the slave trade to Martin Luther King Jr.'s campaign against segregation. Despite its debt to the crusaders of conscience like King, however, modern liberalism remains quite nervous about the kind of activist freedom of conscience that gave it birth and nourished it. Having used the language of obedience to God, filtered increasingly through the prism of individual conscience, as the means by which to resist servile obedience to princes, Western society hopes now to bury this disquieting legacy, lest conscience find in Scripture reason to disobey and even actively subvert the norms of liberal society. We would much prefer now to draw upon the more quietist kind of conscientious freedom that we find in narratives such as Whitty's and Van Drenan's. Christian liberty as carving out a sphere of immunity for faith rather than underwriting any campaign to remake society in obedience to Scripture. You can be free to believe whatever you want so long as it doesn't hurt anybody else or force anybody to change. That is the motto of the modern ideal of freedom of conscience, for which theorists such as John Rawls attempted to supply an adequate theoretical scaffolding. But despite the triumph of Rawlsian rhetoric and much public thinking about religion, politics, and individual freedom, that scaffolding has been under attack ever since Rawls tried to erect it, and has proven increasingly unworkable in the courts. Consider the recent explosion of controversy about religious freedom laws, which, although framed in thoroughly pietistic terms, were seen by many in society as an act of aggression. The conflict of loyalties, then, although certainly rendered more acute by such radical programs of reform as that of the Munster Anabaptists in 1534, or John Brown in 1859, is hardly done away with by espousing a more modest, quietist, and liberal concept of freedom of conscience. Is there then any way to sustain a commitment to some kind of liberal freedoms, which is to say, the freedom to disagree about the good, the true, and the beautiful, and to act on the basis of those disagreements, without undermining the social order? I would argue yes, and it is a theological ground anchored in Protestantism. So 4, the freedom of the citizen. The chief contribution of Protestantism to political thought and to the emergence of liberalism consisted not in the ordering of human institutions per se, whether that be a Calvinist separation of church and state or Richard Hooker's defense of constitutional government, but in the relation of all human institutions to their Lord. Protestantism's two kingdoms doctrine instilled in the Christian a sense of healthy detachment toward earthly loyalties, a healthy realism about what earthly institutions can accomplish, and offered consolation when they failed to achieve their aims. It discouraged any attempt to make the kingdom of God a complete outward reality here and now by force, whether by holy war or holy law. In this doctrine, the authority of political institutions is quite limited. They may command the body to the extent that the demands of civil order and justice require, but they cannot command the mind or the conscience. Each subject remains, in the last analysis, answerable to the Lord who made and redeemed him, not to his prince. This leads to a second and more crucial point, the freedom of the citizen. It can seem, in some of Luther's language, that Christian liberty is interiorized to the point of being almost meaningless. There is a radical interiority in the freedom of a Christian that it would seem remains wholly blind to the external embodiment of this freedom. For Luther and many of the reformers, the freedom of a Christian before God can coexist with complete external bondage, and indeed any claim to have achieved freedom in the earthly realm is illusory, since it is always tainted with the bondage of sin. Understandably, this line of thinking has seemed unacceptable to many modern theologians. It appears to be a stance of complete political quietism, encouraging a dangerous complacency about injustice, inasmuch as it suggests that all that matters is the liberation of the soul from the bondage of sin, no matter how many physical chains remain. This is the doctrine they will rant that would preach the gospel to African slaves while happily continuing the slave trade. This is the doctrine that upheld apartheid. They are no more happy when they read it in St. Paul. Paul may have said that in Christ there is neither slave nor free, neither male nor female, and yet he betrayed his message. Perhaps some other pseudo-Paul later on inserted a different message by calling on slaves to obey their masters, calling for wives to submit to their husbands. The freedom of the gospel on this reading is empty and indeed oppressive if it does not involve a change in external relations, a real empowerment of individuals. The shrewder critics may even venture that this radical interiorization of freedom contributes in some way to the development of the modern autonomous subject, the concept of the naked, unconditioned will that David Bentley Hart identifies as the great modern heresy, that Luther, Kant, and modernity are all part of the same voluntarist line of development. I would argue, however, that even while accepting this essentially inward account of freedom, we can nonetheless allow it to have potentially revolutionary political implications. A merely mental freedom, the freedom to pass judgment on the rightness or wrongness of a law, even while quietly submitting to it for the time being, might seem a feeble freedom indeed, but in fact few things are more powerful, as Richard Balcom argues. That the latter kind of freedom, he says, that is inner freedom of spirit, is real and important, can be seen, for example, in such extreme cases as Soviet dissidents in the Gulag, remaining free in their thinking of a system which oppresses them unbearably, or the Christian martyrs under the Roman Empire, who could be regarded as the most truly free people of their time in their refusal to let even the threat of death cow them into submission. Such freedom in and despite oppressive structures is not only real, but essential to the cause of liberation from oppressive structures. It is only out of their inner liberation from the system that Russian dissidents can publicly protest against and hope to change the system. It needed a Moses liberated by God from resignation to the irresistible power of Pharaoh to lead the people out of Egypt, and it needed the gradual psychological liberation of the people themselves to free them from Egypt, even after their escape from Pharaoh's army." Unquote. By the exercise of such critical intelligence, the citizen is rendered free even in the moment of obedience. Oliver O'Donovan captures the essential insight that we have claimed for this doctrine of Christian liberty. Quote, "Sovereignty belongs not to law, but to truth, for only a perception of the truth can lead us to wholehearted action. The marvel, we may say, is not that the community can demand conformity. The marvel is that conscience can secretly transcend that conformity and pass judgment upon it in the light of truth." Unquote. But of course, in passing such judgment, and when challenging the sovereignty of law, the conscience presses inexorably beyond the bounds of interiority. While evangelical liberty must be understood as an inward rather than an outward freedom, it cannot content itself with only inward expression. For the hope that sustains the free mind in the midst of oppression is the hope of a future in which circumstances may change and outer freedom become a possibility. Quote, "The point is that real freedom cannot be confined to any one dimension." So this is Bauman again. "Inner freedom cannot rest content with outer unfreedom, though it may have to suffer the contradiction in circumstances where outer freedom is unattainable." Unquote. Accordingly, it should not surprise us that in due course, Protestant jurists in the 17th century and 18th century took the lead in constructing institutional forms for the expression of public consent or dissent, for enabling the judgment of each conscience to have a voice in the making of laws, and sometimes even an exemption from their binding force. Of course, O'Donovan qualifies, quote, "Modern liberalism is not yet ready to leap fully armed from the head that first conceived this thought. This is not yet freedom of conscience in a generalized sense. It is evangelical liberty, which is to say the freedom freely to obey Christ. This is a crucial qualification. So long as the freedom of a Christian was understood quite specifically as the freedom of a Christian, not of any old individual who wanted to pursue his or her sense of meaning and ultimate reality, such freedom of conscience remained far off from a general liberal right to freedom of conscience. Indeed, there might seem to be no room at all for the freedom of others to hold and act on erroneous beliefs, which is essential to any liberal theory of toleration. Yet at this point, we must recognize the importance of the Protestant doctrine of adiaphora, the things indifferent that were not essential for salvation, and in which there was ample room for difference of prudential judgment about how to practice obedience to God in society. By means of this concept, a great deal of space was potentially opened up for liberal toleration. When it came to what to believe, the state obviously could not bind the conscience. That, all the reformers admitted, was simply an impossibility. When it came to how to act on that belief in love of the neighbor, then to the extent that most such actions were judged things indifferent, they could in principle be left up to individual judgment, to the extent that civil peace allowed. Thus, O'Donovan concludes, evangelical liberty has proved to be the foundation of a more generalized freedom, including a certain, not indefinite liberty for misguided and erroneous judgment, which is not to say that there is no such thing as evident and unarguable error. It is simply that each person has, not is, his own master, and his master is not the ruler who governs him in the order of civil society. There are some judgments that may be evident enough, but which do not fall to the ruler to make. The ruler has to establish a prima facie interest in the implications for civil order before intervening between any man or woman and the God who commands. That is the correct way of stating the liberal doctrine, which is often put misleadingly as the separation of law and morality. There can be no separation of law and morality. But what there can be, and is a sphere of individual responsibility before God, in which the public good is not immediately at stake. I've covered a great deal of ground in this lecture, so let me try to bring it all in for a quick landing by summarizing the key points of my argument. First, while many scholars have sought to find in the Protestant Reformation the groundwork for liberal freedom of conscience, which is to say a private zone of conviction that does not threaten a neutral commonwealth, the fact is that appeals to freedom of conscience have just as often had a revolutionary and a liberal flavor, demanding reform of the social order and obedience to the law of God rather than men. I noted that this more activist idea of conscience is indeed deeply embedded in the liberal narrative itself, with figures like William Wilberforce and Martin Luther King Jr. appealing to religious conscience in order to challenge the status quo and help establish liberal freedoms. Today, however, liberalism wants to deny this religious foundation, with the result that even more minimalist indications of freedom of conscience are perceived as aggressions against the so-called liberal order. I wanted to contend that Protestantism can and does provide a foundation for a kind of political liberalism by virtue of two key claims. One, political authority can claim only a penultimate obedience, leaving the conscience free. Two, errors of conscience should only be prosecuted to the extent that public order is thereby endangered, meaning that political authority can permit a relatively wide range of beliefs and conduct, without thereby accepting that all paths are equally legitimate. But this means, of course, that an authentically liberal order can only sustain itself on Christian and indeed Protestant principles. A secular liberalism, lacking any means to distinguish between the ultimate and the penultimate, will eventually tend to regress into intolerance and totalitarianism. Thank you.
Thank you, Brad. Our next speaker, Matthew Schmitz, graduated from Princeton University. And if you're from Princeton, you might say that that's all you need to know about a person. But many people have that boast, including the guy who tried to sell me replacement windows a few years ago. None of them, however, got invited to speak at the New York City Convivium. Our next speaker has put his education to good work as literary editor of First Things. He has also written for the Washington Post, the American Conservative, and the Hedgehog Review, but also for scandalous publications like the New York Times. He's come a long way from Nebraska. Matthew Schmitz will address us now on Christian politics after liberalism.
Well, thank you to the Davenant Trust for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here. I was once a Calvinist. I'm now a Catholic, but when I was 17 or 16, I decided I was a Calvinist, and I remember telling my parents this, and they were very alarmed by my declaration. They went to our pastor at our church back in Nebraska, said, Pastor Paul, our son, he says he's a Calvinist. What should we do about this? He said, well, what does he mean? What does he mean by that? And my parents told our pastor whatever I told them. My pastor said, well, yeah, I'm a Calvinist too, and so is my co-pastor. We just don't talk about that. It's not a salvation issue, so that's fine. When I became a Catholic, I just didn't tell my parents. That was way too dangerous. I did eventually figure it out. So my topic tonight is Christian politics after liberalism. Now, it is too early to speak of an end of liberalism, for liberalism never began. We can agree with the economists that our society has passed from feudalism to mercantilism and on to capitalism. There is, I hope, no need to check our iPhones in order to remember the significance of 1776 or 1789. We can hear the echo of the bombs that dropped in 1945, replay the rock music that accompanied the fall of the Berlin Wall in '89. But none of this compels us to agree with Francis Fukuyama that we have witnessed the triumph of liberalism and the end of history. When Fukuyama wrote in '89, he was witnessing an unexpected outcome to the Cold War. Many observers of and protagonists in this standoff between East and West had expected a convergence of the two economic models and a resulting end of ideology. What happened instead was the fall of the wall. NATO absorbed the outlying territories of the former USSR and advanced the doorstep of Russia, as Russia's leaders implemented liberalism from above. Fukuyama did not suppose that these events would be history's last, that war, revolution, and civilized achievement had come to some end. What he foresaw instead was an end of the history of ideas. Here he drew on Hegel's notion, later taken up in a more materialist form by Marx, that history is fundamentally about the progression of a philosophical dialectic. Under this view, mankind progresses through various stages of consciousness, corresponding to different forms of economic and political life. Each stage of history is superseded by another that resolves certain contradictions in the prior formulation. History ends, if it ends, when mankind arrives at an idea that suffers from no inherent contradiction. It was in this sense that Fukuyama believed that history had ended. The victory of liberalism has happened primarily in the realm of ideas or consciousness, he wrote, but is as yet incomplete in the real or material world. Fukuyama's guide to Hegel was Andrei Kojève, a Russian emigre living in Paris who believed that the triumph of liberalism would bring about the creation of a universal homogeneous state. Such a society would be marked not only by material plenty, but also by ideological peace. There would be no war between classes or conflict of ideas, but instead a democratic government to which all consented, guided by principles with which all agreed. Because no contradictions would remain to be resolved, true historical action would become a kind of impossibility. And generals, statesmen, philosophers, and prophets would all go the way of the dinosaur. Kojève took this lesson to heart himself, giving up his teaching and going to work as a bureaucrat for the European Economic Community. If history was at an end, he reasoned, the only remaining task was bureaucratically to manage its implementation. Of course, that implementation could take some time. If Fukuyama thought history had ended in '89, Kojève placed its end date as early as 1806, when Napoleon's guns routed the Prussians. When Fukuyama wrote his essay, Soviet rulers were still mouthing communist slogans, but communism as an idea had lost its power. The fall of the wall was made possible because Russia's elite recognized the deep trends telling against their ideology. What was supposed to be a workers' paradise had fallen behind the decadent West in both economic and military terms. The collapse of belief in Marxism as a governing system was complete. The few true believers who remained claimed that communism had not really failed, had simply been left untried. Today, liberalism is entering its own moment of uncertainty. Three great liberal projects in Europe, the Middle East, and America are in crisis. Liberalism is premised on free markets and public debates that bracket fundamental questions about God and nature. Looking back at these crises, we may one day conclude that this ideal of liberalism has failed, or that it never has been, or could be, tried. There is no more ambitious liberal project today than the European Union. Take the train to Brussels, walk across the Veranda Park, and into the Berlaymont building. This is the home of the European Commission. Depending on which entomologist you consult, it is either the cocoon from which a new Europe will emerge, or the center of a vast spider web of regulation that is choking the continents. My favorite entomologist, though I can't say I trust him, is Robert Manasse, an Austrian writer who went to Brussels with the intention of writing a novel about a bureaucrat. There's an idea for a bestseller. Instead, he produced a short polemic in defense of the EU titled Enraged Citizens, European Peace, Democratic Deficits. His vivid oddball street is the most eloquent defense of an indefensible secular Europe. Manasse makes no apologies for the European Commission's high-handedness, which he sees as a modern variety of Josephinism, the enlightened top-down reform of the Holy Roman Empire during the reign of Joseph II in the late 18th century. Everything for the people, nothing by the people, is the motto for this revolution from above. Manasse's view is increasingly common today. What was once presented as a form of enlightened democracy is now defended as enlightened autocracy. How did a project started by Christian Democrats end in secular authoritarianism? After World War II, politicians in Western Europe sought to prevent another bloody outbreak and strengthen their hand against the Soviet Union. Commerce is the enemy of all violent passions, wrote Tocqueville, and the founders of the European coal and steel community took his advice to heart. French and Germans who had once faced each other across battlefields were now united in a common market. The only problem was that the voters didn't seem to like it. After 54% of French voters rejected the EU Constitution in 2005, Europe's leaders had to bring the Constitution in through the back door by signing the Treaty of Lisbon. Without democratic legitimacy, the need for cultural justification for Europe has only become more intense. When Pope Benedict XVI suggested mentioning Christianity in the preamble to the European Constitution that would never be ratified, Europe's leaders laughed in his face. Religion was a dead letter. The only unifying basis for a common European culture would be a secular idea of human rights. Manasse has some trouble defending this idea. He wants to increase the money for promoting a diversity of European cultures. Expand culture's budget line and we can breathe life into a secular, ahistorical, and anti-imperial Holy Roman Empire. That might be, but I have my doubts. Every culture requires an underlying cult. Rome had its Vestal virgins and civic pieties, and mass. Can progress, liberation, and hygienic sex really become the hearth gods of a new European civilization? One test of the strength of the new European ideal came with the Great Debt Crisis. In America, New Yorkers offer no objection to sending money to Alabama. Connecticut voters do not resent the fact that their federal taxes are redirected to Mississippi. A bond of solidarity unites taxpayers in one state with welfare recipients in another. No such bond, though, seemed to unite Germans and Greeks. Supposedly thrifty and prudent Northerners, who had foolishly loaned Greeks money so that they could buy German goods, were unwilling to forgive the debts of their southern neighbors. German terms by Greek voters, the Greek government caved and took their stingy deal. Greece is not alone in its misery today. It is hard not to notice that a community that promised economic gains has disappointed countries on the periphery. Debt peonage is hardly the basis for a stable new world order. Dissatisfaction in Europe goes beyond economic worries, though. In June, Sohrab Ahmari, a writer for the Wall Street Journal, published an article and commentary titled Liberalism, the Worldwide Crisis. As the governing philosophy, liberalism is fast losing ground, he warned. In forms mild and radical, people are turning away from the belief in open borders, open markets, and the ability of formal procedures to ward off debate on fundamental questions. We can see this in the choice of British citizens to vote for Brexit, and the fact that France's leading presidential candidate is Marine Le Pen. In Austria, the anti-immigrant Freedom Party has entered the runoff for the presidential race, which will be held again in December after one scuttled election. In Hungary, Viktor Orban, a secular anti-Soviet activist in his youth, has moved the country toward Christian nationalism and an alliance with Russia. The Law and Justice Party in Poland, socially conservative and economically interventionist, has moved the country away from the liberal consensus of free market secularity. Russian media channels ridicule Europe's commitment to blasphemous free speech and gay rights, and more Europeans laugh along with them. Liberalism has fared no better in the Middle East. Arab nationalism and secular Zionism both sought to set aside questions of religion and build an order that could be based solely on shared ethnicity and legal norms. Both have now failed. In Israel, prospects for a two-state solution only grow more distant as the ultra-Orthodox gain political power. Writers like David Goldman now endorse the idea of an Israel that is fundamentally illiberal and undemocratic. Better an illiberal Israel, they argue, than the illiberalism of its enemies. In the rest of the Middle East, democratic nationalism has given way to Islamist extremism. The Green Revolution withered, and the Arab Spring has become an Islamist summer. The most costly attempt to establish liberal order in the Middle East has also been the most disastrous. 6 days after missiles hit Baghdad, Tony Blair sent a memo to George W. Bush titled The Fundamental Goal. In it, he wrote, "This is the moment when you can define international politics for the next generation, the true post-Cold War world order. Our ambition is big, to construct a global agenda around which we can unite the world, rather than dividing it into rival centers of power. So our fundamental goal is to spread our values of freedom, democracy, tolerance, and the rule of law. But we need a broad-based agenda of unifying the world to get it." Such a statement reveals how quaint the idea of a war for oil always was. The ambitions of Iraq's invaders went far beyond economic advantage. Bush and Blair hoped to build a new world order, one they were sure would be good for all involved. Alas, they failed. Out of the rubble of Iraq rose the demons of ISIS, a group that presents a particularly calculated and sophisticated challenge to dreams of liberal supremacy. Its videos depict trucks charging across national borders, a sign of its aspiration to cover the globe. It portrays its agents beheading Christians one moment and picking up trash the next, is a sign that no space will be left outside the purview of the caliphate. Is history over? ISIS doesn't think so. I sometimes think that God loves Americans most of all his children. Our crisis of liberalism would feel like a respite from history to any other people, but it is a crisis all the same. Average voters and political elites alike are losing confidence in free trade and open borders, in the political system itself. Usually Trump and Sanders are portrayed as the culprits in this process, and perhaps rightly so. But even the supposedly responsible and mainstream Americans are impatient with any formal or procedural constraint. Take Matt Iglesias, a writer for Vox who plumps for Hillary Clinton. In October of last year, he responded to news of Clinton's email scandals by saying that her unethical behavior made her a more attractive candidate for president. He wrote, "Clinton is clearly comfortable with more comfortable than the average person with violating norms and operating in legal gray areas. This is normally portrayed as a political weakness of hers, and in many ways it is, but it's also an enormous source of potential strength. Committed Democrats and liberal-leaning interest groups are facing a reality in which any political gains they achieve are going to come from the profligate use of executive authority, and Clinton is almost uniquely suited to deliver the goods. More than almost anyone else around, she knows where the levers of power lie, and she is comfortable pulling them. Procedural niceties be darned." Respect the King's College here. That's not what he wrote. With typical eloquence, Iglesias sums his idea up in the phrase, "Hillary Clinton DGAF." I do not believe that Trump will win, but even if he doesn't, we face the prospect of an illiberal administration egged on by the finest minds of our time. Contempt for procedural niceties is not confined to Clinton and her media flax. It has been a defining impulse of progressivism ever since FDR's New Deal, and nowhere is it more obvious than in the institution that should serve as its greatest restraint, the Supreme Court. In 1996, First Things, my employer, though I was not working for it then, published a symposium on the end of democracy. Richard John Newhouse, a proud defender of liberalism in the economic and political spheres, asked whether liberalism wasn't coming to an end in America. He saw, quote, "an entrenched pattern of government by judges that is nothing less than the usurpation of politics," and asked whether we have reached or are reaching a point where conscientious citizens can no longer give moral assent to the existing regime. Some of his closest collaborators, people like Midge Decker and Norman Podhoretz, did not like this way of speaking. Regime was the kind of word loved by the New Left, one that suggested that the American order was unjust and unfree. Newhouse, who had done his time among the left's young bomb throwers, and had even once called for revolution for the hell of it, knew just what he was doing in using the word. He said, "Americans are not accustomed to speaking of a regime. Regimes are what other nations have. The American tradition abhors the notion of the rulers and ruled. We do not live under a government, never mind under a regime. We are the government. The traditions of democratic self-governance are powerful in our civic textbooks and popular consciousness. This symposium, the Symposium on the End of Democracy, asks whether we may be deceiving ourselves, and if we are, what are the implications of that self-deception?" The question Newhouse asked there has been answered today, or I should say it was answered last year, when the Supreme Court issued its opinion in Obergefell v. Hodges. The dissenting justices pointed out that the decision was an act of sheer judicial will. None was more unblinking in his assessment of it than Samuel Alito, a less brilliant writer than Scalia perhaps, but a more sober and far-seeing thinker. Alito wrote, "Today's decision shows that decades of attempts to restrain this court's abuse of its authority have failed. A lesson that some will take from today's decision is that preaching about the proper method of interpreting the Constitution or the virtues of judicial self-restraint and humility cannot compete with the temptation to achieve what is viewed as a noble end by any practicable means. I do not doubt that my colleagues in the majority sincerely see in the Constitution a vision of liberty that happens to coincide with their own. But this sincerity is a cause for concern, not comfort. What it evidences is the deep and perhaps irremediable corruption of our legal culture's conception of constitutional interpretation. Most Americans, understandably, will cheer or lament today's decision because of their views on the issue of same-sex marriage. But all Americans, whatever they're thinking on that issue, should worry about what the majority's claim of power portends. Here, Alito looks into the abyss. It is no longer just controversialists like Richard John Newhouse who say that we have reached the end of democracy. His view is echoed even by the men on the court. Obergefell swept over us like a wave. All of our arguments about the bad outcomes for same-sex households, about the true meaning of marriage, about the correct understanding of liberty were washed away like sticks on the shore. Perhaps this was because we were arguing in terms of liberalism, the very terms that had made gay marriage seem necessary and inevitable in the first place. course, when one is in a fight for one's life, any weapon to hand will do. But some weapons are more effective than others, and some can be turned against those who wield them. Language of rights, freedom, self-determination, and autonomy prove to be just such. Gay marriage opponents argue that a correct libertarian understanding would keep the government out of the marriage business instead of bringing it in. They also appeal to the right of a child to be raised by a mother and father, a right that was supposed to trump that of any gay couple to marry. These arguments are not wrong, but they are strange. A matter of great moral import like marriage cannot be settled by simple appeals to federalism or down-home sense of live and let live. A child may have a right to a father and mother, but it is much more natural to speak of the father and mother having a duty to raise the child. Why frame an argument that springs from a deep intuition about the proper end of the human body in the foreign language of rights? Perhaps we did this because people listen to us only when we appeal to freedom. If that is the case, it only shows how great our task is in the wake of Obergefell. We must teach ourselves and others to speak of duties instead of rights, virtue instead of liberty, truth instead of free speech. Gandhi once had a similar thought. After reading the UN Declaration of Human Rights, he wrote, "I learned from my illiterate but wise mother that all rights to be deserved and preserved come from duty well done. Every other right can be shown to be a usurpation hardly worth fighting for." Perhaps we would not be forced to applaud the current parade of usurpations. The right to gay marriage, the right to pornography, the right to adultery, the right to divorce, if we had taken Gandhi's advice and issued a declaration of human duties instead of a declaration of human rights. It is not enough, it may be counterproductive to say that we should be cautious about gay marriage because children from same-sex households face bad outcomes. This claim is true, but whenever we say it, we suggest that the matter is not really immoral, that can be settled by utilitarian calculations or procedural concerns, and such things are what got us here in the first place. Nonetheless, in the wake of Obergefell, conservatives have continued to cling to the language of liberalism. Religious liberty has become the rallying cry of think tanks and legal groups who are trying to keep sincere Christians like Kim Davis and Barronelle Stutzman out of jail. This is based on the idea that while our fellow citizens may not believe in marriage, they still believe in toleration. And if they are not Christians, they are at least pluralists. In short, we have staked our survival on the existence of American liberalism. Is that a safe bet? One sign it is not comes from the rise of the social justice warriors. These people are increasingly suspicious of the slogans of free speech. Feminists who once stood behind the idea that the First Amendment was a grand old thing are now uneasy with unrestricted free speech. Once deregulation of speech seemed empowering. How could one be free in America unless information on contraceptives could be sent through the mail? Now free speech appears more dangerous. In his column last week, the New York Times rushed out that charted the rise of many other doubters of liberalism. The Tradanistas, the despicably wrong alt-righters, on and on. In Europe, a failure of Christianity has left a continent that cannot extend solidarity beyond the borders of the nation state. In the Middle East, the illusion of secularity has only opened up a wider field for the most vicious forms of Islamism. In America, the belief that politics can be conducted without any reference to final things has led to a denial of nature and culture comp against the Church of Christ. Can Christians offer any response? In the 20th century, most Christians decided to become defenders and perfecters of the liberal ideal. By criticizing its excesses, raising the insights it had borrowed from Christianity, they hoped to turn it toward good ends. The Second Vatican Council of the Roman Catholic Church, once the world's most dogged enemy of liberalism, retired its ancient grudge. It seemed to endorse religious liberty, a principle it had once rejected. It embraced a style of worship that downplayed the divine, and it placed a stress on easygoing ecumenism rather than clearly drawn ecclesial boundaries. Yet the liberalism that overtook the Catholic Church during the Second Vatican Council now appears to be in retreat. Roman Catholicism is regressing to its anti-modern mean. The unlikely leader of this return to tradition is Pope Francis. Though he has sought to modernize the church in some respects, in others he has done more than any pope since Pius X to turn the church against modernity. Where John Paul II and Benedict XVI sought to explain how the faith could fit with liberal society, Francis has attacked that society root and branch. We see this, first of all, in his encyclical Laudato Si. Not since the publication of the Syllabus of Errors in the 19th century has a leader of the Catholic Church issued a document so imbued with anti-modern foreboding. People no longer seem to believe in a happy future, Francis writes. They no longer have blind trust in a better tomorrow based on the present state of the world and our technical abilities. There is a growing awareness that scientific and technological progress cannot be equated with progress of humanity in history. Despite these portents, Francis says, we do not grasp the gravity of the challenges before us, nor do we see we are entering a spiral of self-destruction which currently engulfs us. We stand naked and exposed in the face of our ever-increasing power, lacking the wherewithal to control it. There are no clear solutions. Halfway measures, says Francis, only delay the inevitable disaster. As evidence of this coming disaster, Francis deduces environmental calamities, climate change, pollution, deforestation, monoculture, extinction, and yet he leaves no doubt that the crisis is fundamentally a spiritual one. Its source is our desire to master and manipulate nature, which leads us to use technology that ends up mastering us. The Laudato Si is loaded with quotations from The End of the Modern World, a book written by the mid-century German priest Romano Guardini. Francis has a long-standing love of the German thinker, who, like him, was the son of Italian emigres and studied chemistry. Guardini's book begins with the premise that there's only one standard by which any epoch can be fairly judged. To what extent did it allow for the development of human dignity? In Guardini's terms, not in terms of GDP, life expectancy, or of any other statistic, Francis finds our own time wanting. Technology has joined indissolubly with an economy of uncontrolled greed that allows injustices to combine into an impersonal force, sometimes called progress, sometimes the market, for which no one claims responsibility or accepts blame. Our glorification of technology, Guardini argues, leads us to view everything and everyone as means rather than ends. This entails consequences extending not only from economic exploitation to nuclear warfare, but also from control of conception to interrupted pregnancy, from artificial insemination to euthanasia, from race breeding to the destruction of undesirable life. This is Catholicism in all of its pre-modern glory. In the 19th century, Pope Gregory XVI banned railroads from the Papal States, calling them chemins d'enfer, or ways of hell, a play on their French name, chemins de fer, or ways of iron. Its fear was that they would spread bourgeois and republican ideas subversive to papal authority and right faith. Gregory's belief that technology profoundly shapes belief, and so must be carefully weighed and at times resisted, is a central conviction of Francis's encyclical. Whatever one thinks of any particular condemnation from Gregory or Francis, this is not a foolish view. One of the books Francis cites most frequently in all of his public addresses is Robert Hugh Benson's novel, Lord of the World. This dystopian tale imagines a future in which religion has nearly disappeared, but the Pope now reigns in Rome, having exchanged all the church's other properties in Italy for sovereignty over the city. One of the Pope's first acts in the book is to ban technology, reasoning that, on the whole, the latter-day discoveries of man tended to distract immortal souls from a contemplation of eternal verities. The Pope admits that the banned technologies are good in themselves, since after all, they give insight into the wonderful laws of God. Nonetheless, he judges that at present they are too exciting to the imagination. His conclusion, very close to Francis's in Laudato Si, leads him to remove the trams, the laboratories, the manufactories. And so, Benson writes, the train ceased to run. Francis's encyclical synthesizes the great critiques of his two most recent predecessors, Benedict XVI's dictatorship of relativism and John Paul II's culture of death, in terms of opposition to the locomotive of technological rationality. Francis writes that we should not be surprised to find, in conjunction with the omnipresent technocratic paradigm, the rise of a relativism that is typical of liberalism. There's sexual exploitation, abandonment of the elderly, and the taking of innocent life. Francis calls this the throwaway culture. It is a liberal culture. Though Francis is at war with more traditional Catholics on sexual matters today, as you may have noticed while reading the New York Times, a staff that talks about it with wonderful frequency, Francis's anti-modernism accords well with the increasing traditionalism of the global church. Secularism over time has peeled away more marginal Catholics and left as the faith's only heirs those who are ready for an older and more uncompromising form of their faith. This spring, I attended the ordination and first Mass of a young priest. As the infant children of our friends cried in the pews, I watched him kneel before the altar and elevate the host. After the liturgy ended, we gathered in the parish hall for a reception with sandwiches and soda. Newly minted father entered the room dressed in a soutane. This is a long kind of dress that at certain moments priests have feared to wear because they would be attacked by anti-Catholic mobs. My friend is neither a traditionalist nor a controversialist, but his long garment would have struck a previous generation of Catholic priests as grossly retrograde. I asked him if any of the older priests he knew would be offended by it. He said yes, but that they had by now resigned themselves to seeing such things among their younger colleagues. Not every older Catholic is willing to concede so quietly. A few years ago, I attended a Mass at which the priest began to rage against Pope Benedict and his investigation of American nuns. This is evil, evil, wicked and evil. It is a sin, and Benedict should beg for forgiveness, he said as he preached to us. It was an exciting homily. At the end of the Mass, I approached the priest and I thanked him for his homily, but told him that I didn't think the Mass was the moment for ecclesial editorializing. I said that I instead wanted to hear about the mysteries of the faith. It's a bit smart of me, I guess. The priest looked at me and said, I meet young people like you every day, and it makes me terrified for the future of our church. So that's a sign of the change that's happening in Catholicism. Really, no one expected the church to evolve like this. 50 years ago, my grandfather, a good knight of Columbus, was tasked with removing the high altar from his church in rural Nebraska. This and other elements of the decoration of the church were perceived as elements of an old church that had been superseded by the council. They were rendered obsolete in 1965. He and his fellow knights uninstalled these items, loaded them into the back of a truck, drove out to a washout on one of their farms, and dumped them into the ground. That's the way everything's disposed of where I'm from in Nebraska. Just toss in a washout. My grandfather and his friends refused to remove the statues of saints that the priest also deemed to be outdated and tasteless. But for the most part, they did their duty as good Catholics. Iconoclasm bore its expected fruit, and my father left the church. I was raised outside it, and only after many detours, including a very pleasant one through Calvinism, did I find my way back. When I arrived, I was soon drawn toward the kind of traditional Catholicism my grandfather's generation had been told to discard. Not only did I long for and find comfort in the Latin Mass, I was discomfited by the attempted liberalizations that came with the Second Vatican Council. Where men like John Courtney Murray once sought to reconcile Catholicism and American ideals, I felt no need to elaborate a Catholic idea of religious liberty. I had seen that liberalism is itself illiberal. Every society places limits on belief and imposes penalties on heresy. If secular society does this, why should a Catholic society be any different? The church is a society no less than any other, and like all others, it is realizing the impossibility of liberalism. This impossibility is the one contradiction that has not been worked out, but that only an unashamedly Christian society could hope to resolve. We must be able to combine liberality toward men with loyalty to God, tolerance for others with public acknowledgement of truth. Because of its constant bracketing of fundamental questions, liberalism was never going to be able to do this. It promised us absolute freedom, but demanded our submission. It avowed its secularity, but asked us to worship false gods. Liberalism has ended, but only because we now see that it never began. Rather than defend an ideal that is not so much exhausted as impossible, we Christians must once again proclaim the dawn of the social kingship of Christ. To understand the future, we should look to the past. Thank you.
Thanks to both of our speakers. What we're going to do at this time, it is 8:22. We're going to take a 15-minute break. There's a bunch of refreshments out in the hall that you can enjoy and bill yourself up. And just a quick housekeeping note. We have offered this evening to you free of charge. We're very glad you're able to come and take advantage of that. Should you be interested in offering any kind of donation, just on your own free will to help defray the cost of the evening. There will be a wicker basket out there on the refreshment table. But let's take a break and stretch our legs a bit and be back here in 15 minutes. We'll call you back then.